Good afternoon, gardeners. It's Tuesday, February 16th, and it is a gorgeous spring-like day here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And today I'm going to teach you all about planting asparagus crowns and why you should be growing them in your garden. Asparagus is a cold hardy perennial that grows very well in USDA hardiness zones 3 through 8. So they survive in a wide range of climates, even harsh cold climates. And the wonderful thing about asparagus and why you should be growing them is because once you plant your asparagus crowns and they take root, asparagus typically produces for 20 years. So all you have to do is plant this vegetable once and you can feed your family for 2 entire decades. So in my hands right here I have some beautiful asparagus crowns that I purchased from a local veteran-owned North Carolina company, which I have linked in my Amazon storefront if you're interested. In this hand right here, I have a green variety of asparagus called Jersey Supreme. And in this hand right here, I have a purple variety of asparagus called Pacific Purple. And I like a little bit of variety, so I want to grow both colors of asparagus. So what I'm going to do is, it's best to soak your crowns first for about 30 minutes before you plant them. So right here, I have 2 5-gallon buckets that are half full of water. So I'm going to dump my Jersey Supreme asparagus crowns in one bucket to let them soak, and I'm going to dump my purple Pacific asparagus crowns in the more purple bucket so I remember which one is which. And while the asparagus crowns are soaking, I'm going to prepare my beds for planting. When planting asparagus crowns, it's typically recommended that the crowns are planted with a spacing of at least 12 inches within an individual row. Generous spacing between each crown is required because asparagus grow from an underground rhizome and its very advanced and extensive root system needs ample space to grow. When it comes to spacing of each row, traditional planting methods require a minimum 3-foot row spacing. However, this spacing is geared towards field planting, so this generous spacing is designed to both give the underground rhizome ample room to root and provide a walking path between each row for ease of harvest. For the backyard gardener growing in raised beds, we can plant at a higher density because we don't require a walking path in between rows. In raised beds, row spacing can be reduced to a minimum of 18 inches. This will give each asparagus crown a generous 12-inch by 18-inch growing area for sufficient rhizome development and allow us to plant more crowns in each raised bed because we can eliminate the extra spacing required for a walking path. When selecting a plot for your asparagus, it's very important to remember that this is practically a permanent installation. Whatever ground you choose for your asparagus crowns, they're going to grow for the next 2 decades, maybe even longer. So this bed right here I built specifically for my asparagus crowns. It is 6 feet by 4 feet, and this is going to be a permanent location for those crowns. This bed will never house any other fruits or vegetables of any type. When preparing your bed for asparagus crowns, the first thing that you want to do is you want to remove any mulch that may be on top of your garden if you mulch your garden. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull this back and expose the soil. So now we've removed the mulch layer and we've exposed the soil. Let's talk about trench size and depth. So we are going to space our trenches 18 inches apart, like I showed on the previous diagram. We're going to make each trench 6 inches wide, which will be long enough to sprawl out the roots of the crowns. Now let's talk about depth. Asparagus can grow very long roots. We're talking about 3 or 4 or maybe even more feet deep. The root systems can become enormous because they live for such very long times. So it's important that you plant your crowns sufficiently deep in a good loamy soil. Now, if you are planting your asparagus crowns directly in the ground in a field, you should probably plant them about 12 inches or so deep and then spread a 3-inch or so layer of compost forming a hill or a berm to plant the asparagus crowns on, so you can kind of weave the roots kind of like they're plopped up on a hill. We're not doing that right now. We are planting them in raised beds, so the soil is unnaturally loamy because we never walk in here. It's very light. So because I'm planting this in a raised bed, I'm only going to dig down probably about 9 inches. And like I said, normally I'd place a compost layer on the bottom. This bed right here is 100% turkey compost. So because of that, I'm not going to add any compost at all to this bed. If you're not growing in pure compost, you're going to want to add a compost layer. Now, if you have hard soil under here where the roots are going to be difficult to penetrate, you're going to want to grow this in a very tall raised bed, something that's like an 18 to 24 inch tall raised bed. This is especially true if you put some kind of bottom on your raised bed, like concrete wire or some kind of weed barrier underneath it. You're going to need a very deep raised bed, at least 2 feet deep or more. But my beds are bottomless, they go right into the soil, and I am lucky to have a very sandy, loamy soil, so the asparagus roots are going to have no problem penetrating the native ground underneath. And because of that, I'm not going to have to dig as deeply. So keep that in mind. The harder or rockier your soil is, or if you have bottoms on your raised beds, the taller your raised beds will need to be, because asparagus roots need a lot of depth. So now I'm going to dig 3 trenches in this 4-foot wide raised bed. And right here you can see I dug my trenches probably closer to more like 9 or 10 inches wide, and I dug them down to be about 8 inches deep, and then I placed that berm of soil underneath, which is basically pure compost, and that is going to allow me to orient the roots so the crowns stick directly up and the roots drape around them, and that is going to help my crowns establish more quickly. Now let's talk about fertilizer. In front of me I have bone meal, which is an organic source of phosphorus and calcium, and a more all-purpose organic granulated fertilizer. And asparagus roots like phosphorus and calcium in order to establish, because they are a root, and phosphorus and calcium is critical for root development. Now, asparagus is not the world's heaviest feeder, but they're not light feeders either. They like a good moderate amount of regular fertilizing. So when I bury my roots, I need to give them enough fuel for them to wake up from dormancy, protrude out of the soil, and get a good jump start on the spring. As I mentioned, bone meal is going to help assist in that root development, and when it comes to an all-purpose granulated fertilizer, anything around a 5.55 NPK will work. This is a 3.56 NPK. As long as the numbers are smaller and low strength and fairly close together, and all of NPK are represented, you should be fine. If it's a 4.54, a 3.43, that's all good. Just don't use something like a 34.012. Make sure that they're all low numbers and the NP and K are all represented. So now that we gave our trenches a moderate dusting of bone meal and all-purpose fertilizer, we are ready to plant our crowns. Now we have all of our asparagus crowns placed. The manufacturer recommended that for this purple variety, it's so vigorous that you actually plant them a little bit closer than the recommended 12-inch spacing. Because of their vigor, they recommend trying to almost crowd each other out to keep them under control. So I have a little bit more of aggressive spacing with the purple ones. And here you can see how the hill I created in the middle of the trench is supporting the crown and letting the roots hang lower. So I recommend this type of installation to keep the crown high and the roots a little bit lower so they take root deep in the ground. If you've watched my previous video on how to plant bare root strawberries, you know when it comes to planting bare root strawberries, you cannot bury the crown, because if you bury the crown, it will rot and the bare roots will fail. With asparagus, that's kind of half true. When it comes to asparagus, you will have to bury the crown, but you should only bury the crown with about 2 to 3 inches of soil. Now, if you're planting this in an in-ground field and you dig your trenches 12 inches deep, what most people do is they bury the crown 3 inches, which is only about halfway backfilling the trench. Then they wait for the crowns to wake up, send a shoot to the top of the soil. They let it get a few inches tall, and then they backfill it with the rest of the dirt. I'm not going to be able to do that here because these are a shallower installation. I'm only going to bury them once to be 3 inches. So I'm just going to take my trenches and I'm going to collapse them, and I'm going to place the 3 inches of this soil / compost on top of my crowns. And now that my beds have been filled in and lightly compacted, I'm going to lightly water the crowns in. However, they don't need a lot of water because the crowns are buried pretty deeply. And recall, the deeper the soil, the damper it tends to be. So these aren't something that you need to come out and deeply water every single day. I would not water these unless you get a prolonged dry spell for probably 4 or 5 days. And since you're supposed to plant asparagus crowns in the winter or very early spring, usually it doesn't get hot enough to really evaporate moisture from the soil, so you don't need to water these much at all. Now, asparagus is a cool weather loving plant, so the best time to plant asparagus is in the late winter or early spring after your ground has thawed and is no longer frozen, but before the warm temperatures start setting in. And for me, I live in a location where the ground never freezes, so mid-February to early March is when you want to plant your asparagus crowns in the southeast or other warmer zone 8s. If you live in the northeast or the Pacific Northwest or the Midwest, where you have cooler temperatures than me and spring comes a little bit later and your ground freezes, you're going to want to plant your asparagus crowns as soon as the ground is workable and the really severe freezes are done. So here we are on Saturday, February 27th. It has been 11 days since I planted the asparagus crowns, and already almost half of the crowns overall have broken the surface. The Pacific Purple asparagus variety began breaking the surface as soon as 7 days from planting, and I'm not surprised by this at all because this variety is known to be extremely vigorous and it grows very strongly and quickly. As for the Jersey Supreme variety, I see multiple locations where it has begun breaking the surface, and I'm very happy to see that as well. It's not known to be quite as vigorous as the Pacific Purple, but it's still doing a great job only 11 days in. Now, one thing that you will notice about this asparagus bed is that it's about 2 to 3 inches low in most locations. So once the asparagus crowns all break the surface and the asparagus is about 4 to 6 inches tall, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to top dress this entire bed with about 2 inches of cow manure compost in order to backfill the low areas, and that will further bury the crowns and give them additional coverage. And we will have no concern at all about any of the crowns rotting because they already broke the surface, and we will also add a wonderful additional layer of nutrients to the soil with that additional cow manure because asparagus are moderately heavy feeders. Now, one thing that is critical when growing asparagus is that you do not harvest any of the asparagus at all the very first year. Your very first year, you need to just let these grow naturally and let them take root and develop those roots, because those roots are going to be the foundation of your plants, and you want them to live and last a very long time, at least 15 to 20 years. So first year, don't touch them, let them grow naturally. Their second year, you will be allowed to have a very light harvest of your asparagus plants. They will still be in the establishment period, so you don't want to harvest them too heavily. Again, just a very light harvest. It is that third year that you will actually be able to have a full harvest of your asparagus, because at that point the roots are going to be well established and you will be able to give a full harvest of those plants. So everyone, I hope that this video was very informative. I'm hoping that taking the time to give you a before and after planting of the asparagus is worth your time. That way you can see this method does work, and very successfully as well. So everyone, thank you all so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please hit that like button, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe for future updates and more videos like these. If you're curious about where I purchased these asparagus crowns from, or you're curious about any of the products that I used in this video or in my garden in general, they are all linked in my Amazon storefront in the video description. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video. Okay, Dale, let's show everyone how good of a catcher you are. We have some bacon bear bites right here, which unfortunately contain no bear at all, but they do contain real bacon. Stay. Ready? Catch. Oh, that was a very good catch, Dale. Sit. We have another one for you. Very good. Let's go for 2. Oh, number 2. Okay, Dale, one more. Sit. And 3 for 3.